Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Haunted Dolls and Curses video. Well, for this actual entry, I came across it while I was looking at another new suggestion. So in this case, I thought to myself, the information on here is just so good and it involves multiple factors that it definitely was something that I wanted to share here. First of all, so it has to deal with a screaming skull, which is an introduction, a brand new thing here to my channel, as I never talked about that before. And it also has to do not only with a curse, but also a haunted or series of hauntings there at a particular location. So it's almost like 2 or 3 for 1 when it comes to this particular entry. But you're looking at a indication of it now. It goes by several names, but the most common name is this. It's known as the Screaming Skull of Burton Agnes Hall. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating info associated with this multi-factored suggestion. So what is this Screaming Skull of Burton Agnes Hall? Well, for starters, let's go ahead and let's talk about essentially what a Screaming Skull is. Again, this is a brand new way, a brand new introduction here on my channel. Can't believe I haven't talked about these before, but essentially a Screaming Skull is an object, usually a human skull, although it can involve other type of bones as well, that has some paranormal factors tied to it, meaning there's something along the lines of haunts or some other type of spectral items that occur because of this paranormal object. And the way it works is most of the time, as long as it stays within a certain location, then the skull is fine. Everything is a-okay, there's no problems, no issues. However, if the skull is moved to a different location, it almost acts like it's alive. It almost goes into a tantrum of sorts, and then that's where its legendary scream begins, because people can apparently hear the wails of this person, whoever is tied to that skull. Well, they'll apparently scream into the dead of the night, haunt that location, move things, have some kind of apparitions come forward, generally just cause all kind of chaos until the skull is returned to its proper location, and then that seems to satisfy this Screaming Skull. Very fascinating stuff when I was reading this information. I'm sure there are a bunch of other Screaming Skulls that I can cover here in the future, and I look forward to those, but here I just wanted to mention again what essentially that object is. Now, as far as the legend of the Screaming Skull, let's go ahead and let's talk about that here as far as Burton Agnes Hall. So Burton Agnes Hall you're looking at now, it looks like it's a beautiful estate. It looks like one of those places that Bruce Wayne would have in one of his movies, no? Like whenever it cuts to a faraway shot of his home of Wayne Manor, doesn't it look like a perfect place here to film in one of those locations? But this is an area that's been around for a long time. Apparently the estate itself, like the land, has been in some kind of ownership since the 1100s, so we're talking almost 1,000 years now. And then ultimately the house itself, you call it like the actual estate or the manor, was built in the early 1600s, 1601 to be specific, and it was built by a gentleman by the name of Sir Henry Griffith. Now, some of this information is apparently still disputed, like when it comes to the Screaming Skull, because there's various angles that it can go with. So again, you can take this information lighthearted because it may be right, it may be wrong. There's just so little proof, I guess, if you call it that, when it comes to verifying this stuff. But the most common aspect is this. This guy, Sir Henry Griffith, had at least 3 daughters, and each of those daughters lived there in that house. It may have actually been built, even a portion of that manor, just essentially for them. That's disputed, though, because it may have been also that this part of the manor that became haunted later on was built for other young women that were not part, in this case, of Sir Henry Griffith's daughters. But still, that, at least the most traditional case is that. And so somewhere along the way, while the house was being built, the daughters were out and about, and there was one by the name of Anne. Even her name, though, is being disputed in terms of her being the original Screaming Skull, like the Screaming Skull belonging to her. But still, let's go with that as far as the more commonly known tradition of this legend. So the way it goes was Anne was moving about, in this case towards the park. There was an area right in front of that manor that had a very large section, of grass, of forest. It was almost like a man-made built park there. And as she was walking around, unfortunately, she was attacked and then mortally wounded by something that was considered a cutthroat. I had to look this up, but apparently it's an old adage associated with a murderer or some kind of violent criminal. So that's essentially who attacked her. Whoever this person was, it remains anonymous to this day. Maybe he was just walking about. Maybe he was watching them for a good time and then finally saw his opportunity. Either way, though, he mortally wounded this poor young woman, Anne, and then she, of course, was found, and then that's when she was taken back into the manor. Unfortunately, though, she didn't die right away, meaning she had to suffer through a fever, and this fever went through some time, and then finally her sisters, before she was going to pass away, or they were realizing that she was about to pass away, they told Anne that because this was apparently her favorite place, her favorite manor, that they would make sure that she would be in that hall. I don't know the exact area or the location, but somewhere in that manor before she passed away, or in order to make sure that she saw the completed structure, or if she did pass away afterward, they would still make sure that Anne was brought into that manor, and even after death, if you could call it that, like try to have her see, in quotations, the manor itself, almost like a death wish when it comes to that fact. And so that's what apparently that promise was. Unfortunately, though, when Anne passed away, the legend goes that the two sisters, her two other sisters, and these were again the daughters of Sir Henry Griffith, decided that no, they weren't going to head and fulfill this promise. Instead, they ended up burying Anne nearby in some other location, but they did not have her see the manor. And then that's when this curse started. So apparently after this finished, that's when that location was, quote unquote, plagued by strange moaning and weird sounds that kept occurring on a nightly basis. This was very, very bad stuff, apparently. Like walls were rattling. There was apparitions that would come about as well. Here, they would appear in certain portions of the hallways, and then they would disappear afterward. There was, of course, the screams that people would hear as well. In terms of finally somebody decided, and they put 2 plus 2 together, and they realized that there was this notion that it must be belonging to Anne. Like, in other words, that this promise that was never fulfilled, this is Anne's version of reminding them of it, and then that way they wanted to make sure that it truly did get done. So they ended up actually looking at her grave again, and they were shocked whenever they took it out. And then they looked at it, they saw that the skull was already detached from the body. Like it was just completely removed. It was still there within the casket itself, but the skull was completely separated from the body. On top of that, it was called fleshless. Like in other words, it was just 100% a regular skull as opposed to having some decomposing stuff on it like with the rest of the body. Here, though, the skull was essentially 100% already gone of the flesh itself. And so they put it into an area there within the manor. I don't know how they did it. I don't know if they put it into some kind of display or if they tucked it away in some corner and made sure that it just stayed hidden. Either way, though, that seemed to appease Anne and her screaming skull status. Everything was a-okay when it comes to that part. Unfortunately, though, a little bit later afterward, the way the legend goes about the screaming skull, it happened again. One of the servants that was there in that location either didn't believe about the screaming skull legend of Anne or didn't care, and either way, or didn't know, in other words, as another possibility, and they ended up taking that skull, put it into a cloth, and then they threw it into some kind of wagon, I'm guessing to be buried elsewhere, to just find a proper burial place, or to probably bury it back into Anne's official burial spot. Either way, though, whenever that happened, the horse and the horse that was carrying this newfound casket, if you call it that, started trembling in fear. It reared up, and then at the very same time, in the manor itself, the hallways once again shook, so much so that actually pictures pretty much fell off of the walls themselves. When I was reading that information, I imagine like most other manors or estates, it's probably those very large pictures, the ones that almost take up the entire wall itself. You can imagine one of those falling off and the calamity that creates. Well, that's essentially Anne and her screaming skull status that was telling once again she was not happy that she was being moved. And so whenever they realized that that's what must have occurred in terms of the servant's actions, then afterward the skull was taken back and it was placed, this time permanently, within one of the walls itself of the manor, and that's where the legend ends. If you go now to that location there at Burton Agnes Hall, somewhere mysteriously, anonymously, within one of those walls, that's where Anne's skull is. It's placed into what's called a niche into one of the walls, and it was just completely walled up afterward. No notes, no indication, nothing in terms of where the skull was placed, and ever since then, hundreds of years later, it still apparently remained mysteriously within one of those walls. But that seems to have again made things peaceful when it comes to that location. But who knows if Anne will one day still act things up. You know how I've read certain locations where if you start changing things, like within a place and a spirit or some kind of other cursed object is there, they'll make their intentions known. Like, let's say you try to do some renovations or you try to tear down certain portions of a location, then that's when they might come out again with their displeasement. But that's how it goes. If you're lucky enough to go to that hall to this day, who knows, the wall that you're walking by or that you're leaning against may actually have Anne's legendary screaming skull right there. And apparently she still haunts that location to this day. Every now and then people will see something, like in terms of some kind of fragment of shadows or something else that's there at that location, but it could be still a haunting of some other sort, but who knows. But if anybody has any more info, anything else might have missed, please post those comments below. Anybody there happen to be fortunate enough to go to that location there at that hall, that Burton Agnes Hall? How was it like? I mean, did you get an eerie sensation when you were there? Did you feel like you were having any kind of curse placed on you while you were there as well? If so, please let me know, because I always love hearing again what the local statuses are when it comes to experiences. So, all right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.